Good morning. I believe my slideshow is going to be included. If we can get the slideshow up, that would be helpful. In the meantime, like what was announced, my name is Cupid Alexander, and I get asked about it a lot of times. No, I was not born on Valentine's Day. I am currently Assistant Director of Housing and Planning in the city of Austin, Texas. It's really early here, so if my brain is not connecting the dots, blame the time and not my heart. This is a difficult conversation in the United States because of the history of the United States, especially when it comes to race relations, because race relations has always been a little bit divisive. It's never really been used as a tool of resiliency, investment, development, or reconciliation. Thus, in this conversation, the responses will seem to come short, as no tool has been as effective to tear down a part of the community as racism. As an operationalized and weaponized bias that is very inclusive when it comes to who loses. Yet I believe with the examples I will provide from the cities of Austin, Texas, and Portland, Oregon, showing how using geographic and other ethnographic data can help guide strategic investments in historically marginalized areas that coincidentally have a high percentage of people of color, particularly that of the Black diaspora. Because we have limited time, I will try to cover as much as I can within the 20 minutes provided for this talk. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you all a brief outline of what I'll be covering today. The primary focus was to tell a story of how we got to this point in these two cities and how we are using mapping software, data, and policy to create infrastructure investments that can help reconcile the past and provide resilient outcomes that we can measure. I do want to call out something. I am not using the word reparations because this is not reparations at all. Reparations would be prioritizing those based on the premise under which they were ostracized, which is race. This does not do that. Next slide, please. One of my favorite speeches that I listened to comes from a 1984 Democratic National Convention speech by a man named Mario Cuomo. He was the governor of New York, and his son was also recently governor of New York. And it aptly indicates American city development and the state of people then, and coincidentally now. In it, he was addressing the then president, Ronald Reagan, and he said this, and I quote, 10 days ago, President Reagan admitted that although some people in this country seem to be doing well nowadays, others were unhappy, even worried about themselves, their families, and their futures. The president said that he didn't understand that fear. He said, why this is a country is a shining city on a hill. And the president is right. In many ways, we are a shining city on a hill. But the hard truth is that not everyone is sharing in the city's splendor and glory. A shining city is perhaps all the president sees from the portico of the White House or the veranda of his ranch, where everyone seems to be doing well. But there's another city. There's another part to this shining city, the part where some people can't pay their mortgages and most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need, and the middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. In this part of the city, there are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it. Even worse, there are elderly people who tremble in the basements of the houses there, and there are people who sleep in the city streets, in the gutter, where the glitter doesn't show. There are ghettos where thousands of young people without a job or education give their lives away to drug dealers every day. This is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see, in the places that you don't visit in your shining city, end quote. This statement sums up exactly what you're going to see. Next slide, please. First, in Portland, Oregon, a beautiful city in the northwest part of the United States, very environmentally green, very economically well off. Home to international athletic brand Nike and the North American headquarters of Adidas. Known for its food, art, and culture, many people here have adopted a Keep Portland Weird slogan to describe this city. So what you're looking at is a view of the downtown both during the day and at night. Coincidentally, I am from Portland, Oregon. Next slide, please. This next slide is the downtown view of Austin, Texas, located in the central southern part of the United States. Austin is not only the capital of Texas, it is the home of a booming tech economy. Dell Computers is headquartered here. Oracle is headquartered here. One of the world's richest men lives here, Elon Musk. Apple, Samsung, Tesla, and Google have all expanded and centralized parts of their headquarters here. Often called the live music capital of the world, Austin is known for its live music venues, its food culture, and for also having the same slogan as Portland, which is Keep Austin Weird. I think that that's weird. Next slide, please. Additionally, both are the most populous cities in comparison to the metropolitan area that they are in. Of the 2.3 million people in the Austin metropolitan statistical area, which is the area of the city and including surrounding suburbs, Austin makes up a little less than half. Portland, on the other hand, makes up about a third of the metropolitan statistical area of about 2.2 million. In Austin, it has a large white population, a large Hispanic population, many of which who identify as Hispanic white, and a dwindling Black and brown population. Similar to Portland, Oregon, has a majority white population, and in fact, Portland is the largest big city in the United States with a white majority population, and it has a dwindling Black and brown population. So I kind of wanted to paint this picture, and as you can see, there's a little bit more data as far as the married population, the male to female ratio population, and the family size. These are very growing cities. They are both top 25 as far as size-wise in the United States. And I wanted to give you all a feel of what the city makeup looks like and some of the demographics. Next slide, please. And both cities have a history of racialized segregation. I'm going to let that breathe for a second. This is unique as both have very liberal voting constituencies and have routinely been shown to lean liberal, often in both local and national elections. So what you're looking at are the historical maps of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, which use color-coded maps to determine the loan worthiness of areas in each of the cities. As the purpose of the HOLC was to refinance faulty loans and to expand home ownership opportunities, you can see why a federally backed program limiting opportunities would be problematic. And let me tell you how. This was driven by the presence of Black people and others deemed undesirable, including those of Asian descent, Hispanic descent, and Native American descent, or just poor. And what you're looking at is the areas that are outlined in red were determined to be risky areas to invest in or to support loans. Though not all of these groups were always included as a red line worthy group, one group was consistently named, those who were Black. These maps guided loans that could secure underwriting, homeownership loans by banks, and additionally were used in discussing land development, infrastructure investment, and where the siting of undesirable materials and disposals could possibly go in cities. They were also critical in pointing out areas where loans lacked competition, thus exposing the people in these neighborhoods to high interest rates or denial of credit, and sometimes denial of insurance. The most risky areas were those that were redlined. Uniquely, they had a high presence of those who are of the Black diaspora and also of Hispanic and Latino descent. Next slide. What I'm pointing out is that in this mapping, you see how racialized bias was weaponized to determine where opportunities were going. not based off an aesthetic or a desire to have a connected community, not in regard to topography or proximity to amenities, not even to create them. Instead, the barriers were people of darker skin color, which is evidenced in both cities and almost every other single American city. So I don't want to act like these two cities were the only ones. There are numerous American cities that had similar maps that helped guide investments during times where economic growth was happening and left out large parts of the American people. In fact, these maps guided many investments and underwriting opportunities and criteria well into the 1970s and the 1980s. Next slide. So, what do we do with this? Glad you asked. Instead of reinventing the wheel, we use a similar geographic and proximal assessment to prioritize those who should be invested in. Let me show you how. Next slide. In this first graph, you see the zoomed in area from our previous gentrification map in Portland. This shows how the Black community has shifted as they have been priced out, primarily due to new urbanist policies that pushed for environmentally friendly and less invasive development and a lot of infill development. Over the years, new urbanist homesteaders moved into under-resourced communities, primarily Black in Portland, to take advantage of underused and underinvested land, and thus created a market where it was difficult for renting families to compete for homes. So what you're seeing on the screen is the shift in population. What I don't have on here is the shift in policies that led to individuals going back to cities. But if you know of American cities, you know that this connected and thriving and green and less invasive use of land has been really one of the pushes that we've had in the United States. And it's evidenced as a result of individuals being displaced, primarily people of color, in some of these now popular areas. Next slide, please. This next slide is in Austin, Texas, and it shows how even as of 2020, the city was still segregated primarily on the redlining maps from earlier. So if you look at the redlining maps, and if you look at this current map, you will see that not only is the city economically segregated, it's racially segregated, almost similar after decades as the redlining map that ensured loans were being given. You can also see on the right side that studies show that as of 2015, Austin, Texas was one of the most economically segregated areas and metros in the United States. Next slide, please. And to make matters worse, if we didn't have enough, here are two slides that show how highway infrastructure projects gutted redline communities in both Austin and Portland, eliminating Black homes through what's called takings or eminent domain or low-cost acquisitions that, when coupled with redlining, left outnumbered Black and brown community members with little recourse and little housing options. So not only did it eliminate some of the housing that it had, because eventual highways came into some of the places where housing was for these individuals, they were unable to secure a loan outside in other neighborhoods and could not have enough, there wasn't enough housing stock in their neighborhoods where they lived in. Next slide, please. So how do we use this information to prioritize our current investments? Glad you asked. Next slide. In Portland, one of the creative ways this is done is by focusing on the gentrified and historically redlined areas and using the timeframes for which the city action gutted housing opportunities as the nexus between investments that are going in and who receives them. So basically, what I'm saying is the city gave priority based off of points. If you could show that your family was in the area when city actions happened that destroyed the community. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this faced serious litigation, and the city of Portland funded developments that would prioritize families for these now high amenity neighborhoods, primarily without federal investments. It also used this formula to fund home ownership opportunities, awarding qualified families up to $125,000 in grants to purchase a home in the area. And how it did this is that if you were in the red area or the yellow area or the green area, you got a certain number of points. Everyone could apply, but how it prioritized those who would receive the funding first was in regards to the historical actions the city had done to eliminate opportunities. Now, this wasn't a form of reparations, but this was a form of reconciliation, of recognizing what was happening, what happened in the past, and working towards improving the outcomes. And that's going on even today. Next slide, please. In Austin, Texas, we use the same displacement map that where our city investments go based off the geographic mapping and historical data. And this allowed longstanding members within the community to benefit from infrastructure and housing investments while they are still going in, and prioritizes these investments in their neighborhoods. So what you're seeing is there was a report called Uprooted, and it indicate the areas that were prone to displacement. Now, if you looked at the previous redlining map, you will see that the areas prone to displacement are currently where individuals of color, specifically Black and Brown, have historically lived. So instead of using those maps to gut individuals, we were using these maps to prioritize where investments go as the city continues to thrive and grow, trying to get ahead of it. So I know I've said a lot. I know that this is not enough time for us to go as in depth as we want to go, but I wanted to give a high level overview of what we're doing in this city, how we're using some of the mapping software and the historical maps to prioritize and direct investment, and it guides our policy and development of the city. And I have 5 keys. If you can go to the next slide, I think we already went past it, but it said, yes, here's 5 keys of observations that I want to leave you with in closing. Like I said, I know we didn't have enough time to really discuss in depth everything that I wanted to, but I wanted to say that context is key when we're having these discussions. A lot of the individuals lived during these times and they're still alive. In fact, I had a conversation many years ago with a lady who was in her 90s, and her house had been taken in an area that we had not developed. And in fact, she had bought her house maybe 40 years before for $20,000. 40 years later, she was paid $20,000, like the house hadn't just appreciated in value. And she saw that even maybe 30 years after that, nothing was done with it. And it hurt her. Bringing that context to the conversation and recognizing that is key. The next thing is that an analyze. We use deep analysis to understand historical mapping, historical actions, historical policies, because for a country rooted in the history, we have to look at all of our history and analyze what should happen, how we're going to do it, and where it's going to happen. The next thing is our reentrification. So that's patent pending. So if you use it, I'll know. But it's really the process of how we're going to reprioritize individuals in these communities to have a growing, thriving, and connected community. When we know the history is that taxation taxed everyone, but those resources weren't used to support everyone. So we owe it. It's a healing, and it's reconciling some of the past. The next one is new measures are needed and new processes are needed. Sometimes to have a new narrative, you have to have new narrators. We need to make sure that we are measuring new things, that we're asking for new things, because the old didn't necessarily include all of our community members, even though everything was asked of them and they've been contributing. And the last thing that I leave you with is historical and racial deinvestment can only be reconciled, right? So this is not reparations. This is not giving to people everything that they've lost. A lot of our programs still require you to income qualify, but these 2 examples show ways that we're using information And we're using geographic data and geographic tools to prioritize our investment. My last slide, next slide, please. Let's stay connected. It's early here, but I am going to be on listening. Find me on LinkedIn, Cupid Alexander, real name. Happy to be friends, happy to learn from each of you. I do want to thank the university for inviting me. I came on behalf of NARO, a person by the name of Liz Glenn, one of my favorite people, had asked me to give this presentation. I'm so excited to be here. With that, I will turn it back over to the panel. Thank you.
Big applause to Cupid. Cupid, that was absolutely insightful. We really thank you for having, I think there are very interesting points that you have raised. I don't know if you want to go, if you have any questions. If you prefer to have some questions now, or if you want to note the questions, perhaps in the chat box, and then we can have all the questions at the end.
Yeah, I would hate to take the time. I want to hear from some of the other presenters. If there's any questions that are on people's minds right now, maybe we'll have 5 minutes of questions, but I don't want to take all the space from the other wonderful presenters. I can't wait to hear from my colleagues from all over, but I'm happy to answer anything within the next couple minutes, and then we can move on. And I'll turn my camera off, but I will be listening, and then I'll come back on when everyone has presented. So
that's absolutely fine. So any urgent question for Cupid? You don't have to feel any pressure. If you have any questions, you can note the question in the chat box, and then we can try to find a little bit of time at the end to answer all the questions. And then, of course, if you want to get in contact with Cupid, we will provide you with all the details, contact details. Thank you, Cupid, for this excellent presentation. Thank you. So now we can go to our second presentation, which is titled Vendor and Pedestrian Experiences of the Right to the City in Street Design and Management in Small Urban Centers in the Wemba district, South Africa. Our presenters are Wendy Sorio, Immaculate Ingwani, James Shakwizira, and Peter Beacom. I'm very sorry for the bad pronunciation. Please forgive me for that. I will ask, perhaps Wendy wants to start. Wendy, I think you are muted, so thank you. Excellent. The floor is yours, Wendy. You can start anytime. Oh, sorry, Wendy, just a second. I can see a raised hand, Chiara.
Hi, Dr. Lockyer, how are you?
Good morning.
I'm not sure if it was communicated. I'm currently in Poland with Professor Magda Misha, attending the World Urban Forum. I have another presentation here, and I was asked if I could present first, but I think I had a problem with linking on. So would it be possible if I can present before Wendy, if that is okay? If not, I will wait my turn.
So you mean, Chiara, you want to present right now?
Yes, I have yes, if it's possible.
Okay, then we have to ask Wendy if she's fine with that. I was not informed.
I don't have a problem with that.
Sorry, Wendy?
I do not have a problem with that. It's all right.
Oh, that's very, very nice from you. So Chiara, yes, all right. Let me read your. So your presentation was supposed to be the last one.
Yes.
All right. So the presentation of Chiara Rampul, which is one of ours from UKZN, from Durban. The title of the presentation is Exploring the Concept of Women Paving the Way to an Inclusive Pan-African City. So if Wendy is okay with that, we can start with your presentation, Chiara.
Okay, can I share my screen?
Yes, you do, you may. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Dr. Lockyer, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
I'll make you co-host just now. You should be able to.
Okay.
Thank you, Musa.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes, Chiara. Everything good.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm honored to be part of this international symposium, and I apologize in advance for that miscommunication there. So my topic today is exploring the concept on women paving the way to an inclusive Pan-African city. African women are seen as, one of society's most marginalized groups because they are very public, vocal, and are the center of many liberation movements. They're said to be the heart of African cities. African women constitute more than half of the population in Pan-African cities. So I guess one should say, cities should be designed around them. Today, my focus of my presentation is on urban spaces to achieve inclusive cities. So what is an inclusive city? A city that is inclusive appreciates all of its residents and their needs equally. Women's experience in urban space is different from that of men, as women use the environment differently, as they have several forms, traditions, roles, and responsibilities. I read something recently. Which said if an alien were to walk the urban spaces of many of our cities, it would think everyone in the city is young, able, and a man. Public spaces are not gender neutral. I admit this sounds a bit strange. This was one of the criticisms highlighted by Western feminists in the 1970s. So that was 51 years ago, right? So there must be some changes. Everyone would think that. Unfortunately, not much has changed. In some public spaces, public spaces today are still designed with the assumption that the primary beneficiary group who would access it is going to be a young, healthy man. So when we design a public space, we design it for the public. But who is that public? The way women walk on a pavement is very different from the way a man walks. Men are less likely to move and make a way for their female counterparts on a crowded pavement. There's a belief that the public domain is a man's space, a man's place. Many experiments have gone about, and many experiments have shown that women in public spaces are still not considered eligible to confidently access the domain as their own. I think women's participation in urban planning and the momentum of social media can help create the safer cities for women and for everyone overall to achieve that inclusive Pan-African city. So during my visit in Poland, this is one of the photos that we got to see while Prof and I were on our walk. This is an inclusive, as you can see, this is where, if we go back, there's a pram there. This staircase is an inclusive staircase. It makes it accessible for women who have prams, people that are disabled, and this is visible that Poland has included this in their design. I've yet to see one in a Pan-African city. If we look at the global case studies, I've put two examples. The one is the city of Vienna, Austria, and the second is the city of Whittlesea, Australia. I think many people are familiar with the city of Vienna. A lecturer at Vienna University stated that men design cities as if only men are going to work and return home occupied them. Therefore, policymakers involve or should involve female architects while planning for a city. In the city of Vienna, it is a perfect example, as in the 1990s, a photography exhibition shed light on how women use the city. This established the city's Women's Office, which carried out surveys on gender usage of the city. The findings motivated that governments to increase street lighting, widen pavements, and improve pedestrian access. During COVID lockdown, I thought women in public spaces and access to the domain is a strange issue to discuss when the world is confined to those four walls of their homes. However, the past months, it is evident that we people are ready to rebuild the society while learning to live with COVID-19. Access to public spaces that fit user requirements remain a challenge. I think cities will be better, inclusive, when they're able to fulfill the needs of individuals and communities in the areas of housing, public space, livability, and other issues, considering and responding to thoughts from city dwellers about how they inhabit their own environment. So lessons to learn from global case studies for Pan-African inclusive cities to achieve a Pan-African inclusive city is we've got to work with better urban planning to improve. To make parks appealing, girls, designers created or need to create what amounted to a gender segregated spaces. I know we try to move away from that, but maybe that's a step to making public spaces accessible for women and allowing them to feel safe in these spaces. Part of gender mainstreaming public policy in Vienna is park space. They've got that gender segregated spaces, which they've installed volleyball, badminton courts for girls, and divided the open spaces into more private spaces with landscape, more benches, encourage socializing. They made the park more appealing to girls. So I think going for strategic plans and initiatives are to be put in place to support the explicit inclusion of needs, concerns, and lived experiences of women to shape more equitable policy outcomes for residents of all genders. Before I conclude, I would like to mention this one of my study findings during my master's research. It said representation is about more than simply making faces and bodies visible. It is about making experiences evident. I think urban planning and urban space design within Pan-African cities has long responded to its existing uses, rather than creating opportunities to entirely new behaviors. And going forth, we need to make experiences evident. We need to include women, listen to what they have to say, and incorporate that into our design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Absolutely, I totally agree, and I think your message is absolutely relevant. It is one of the key outcomes, the key fundamental objective to achieve an inclusive city. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I will ask the audience if there are any urgent questions for Chiara before she goes. Any questions? So if you have any questions,
I do have just one question that I'd like to ask. This is Professor Jordan from Morgan State University. This is an area that I think is really critical, especially when you're talking about the African continent and women in general. Now, one of the questions that I have is, are you familiar with the book Discrimination by Design by Leslie Kane Wiseman? It was done in the 90s, where she speaks about male-made environment as far as understanding the way that the world that we live in general. And then also, I guess another question is, what is the difference between the African, when you talk about the Pan-Africanism, the African woman in relation to colonialism and the white population, quote unquote?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't really get it.
Yes, so the first part of that is, are you familiar with the book Discrimination by Design from Leslie Kane Wiseman that was written in the 90s, where she talks about a male-made environment that we live in general? And second question is, what is the relationship, or how are you looking at the Pan-African woman in relation to colonialism in today.
Okay, understood. So to answer your first question, I haven't read that book. I will add it to my list. Thank you for that suggestion. Your second question, the relation with Pan-African women and colonialism. I think, I mentioned before that Pan-African women especially are one of society's most marginalized groups, and that's linked because they're very vocal, they're very public, and they're linked to a lot of liberation movements. So, how can I say? Okay, I'm not really getting onto that question, but when I get that answer, I will share that with you.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
So, Chiara, there is another question in the chat box, and Idris is asking, what is the position of gender mainstreaming in urban planning for Pan-African cities?
What is the position of? Okay. So to answer Idris's question, there are many strategies and policies that are in place in certain Pan-African cities. And I think slowly the both professionals in the built environment are trying to incorporate this in their design. Obviously, we haven't fully achieved it. We've now noted that where we've missed those certain parts in our design, and we're now starting to include it.
Yeah, thank you, Chiara, for the insightful response.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions for Chiara? If not, we thank you so much, Chiara. Thank you for making the time. I know you are attending the other conference, so it's such a pleasure to have you here. We will let you know if there are any other questions coming from the audience today. Thank you very much, and I will see you at home. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye. So now we can move back to Wendy presentation. So Wendy, so I can repeat again the title of your presentation: Vendor and Pedestrian Experiences of Their Ride to the City in Street Design and Management in Small Urban Centers in the Wemba District, South Africa. Please, Wendy, you can come in and start anytime.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Excellent.
Good afternoon, everyone. I trust I find you well. I'm going to present this paper on behalf of all my colleagues. So those are part of the authors to this paper, the contributors, but I'll be leading this presentation for this chilly afternoon. It's chilly down here in, I'm in Zimbabwe at the moment. So I'll start. May I please have the next presentation, the next slide, please? That's the presentation outline for your note. Next. Okay, so the study looks at how vendors and pedestrians, how they experience their right to the city on street spaces and small towns.
Wendy?
Of that, streets become sites for contestations and negotiations, and users desperately experience their right to the city on these street spaces. Next slide, please. So that is for the definition of the right to the city on street spaces. The right to the city when it comes to defining the right to the city on streets, we are saying that it pertains to a various set of rights or claims that users can make on a particular space. And it also pertains to the fair and equitable distribution of social spatial qualities on such spaces. And can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this study, the presentation seeks to just examine or share notes on what we found out from my study on how vendors and pedestrians perceive street spaces and how it affects their right to the city experience. Next slide. So to properly conceptualize the study, what we're saying is that, like I said, we have different users who use the streets. And in this study, we were arguing that pedestrians and street vendors who use the sidewalks are mostly the disadvantaged users on street spaces. You find that in the small towns, the issue of homelessness is not really topical, although you could consider homeless users as disadvantaged users on streets. But in the context of small towns, you don't find such people on the streets, probably because of the kinship issues and the socialization context where people actually stay with their relatives. In the rural hinterlands that support these, the rural hinterlands that feed into these small towns. And we also, the issues of street children are not common. So in our context, we're looking at pedestrians and street vendors, who are the most common forms, most common street, non-vehicular street users in the small towns. And so our argument on this conceptualization is that we're saying the town where a user is located, or their age, gender, or physical condition, whether they are physically able or they have walking mobility challenges, or the activity that they're conducting on the street, it all has an influence on how the users perceive or how they experience various spatial attributes on streets. For example, it affects how they perceive safety and security of the street. It affects how they perceive issues of accessibility, issues of legibility, as well as maintenance and management on the streets. And all this then affects their disparate right to the city claims. We are saying that when a user has how a user experiences or perceives safety and security on the streets affect their right to safety and security, or how a user might perceive accessibility affects their right to access on the street. So that's sort of the relationship on how users experience affect their right to the city claims. Next slide, please. And that table there is just representing the social spatial qualities that we were measuring on the particular streets. We wanted to find out whether how the issues of safety and so forth were affecting the pedestrians and the vendors. Next slide, please. So that's just to situate our study area. It's in the northern part of South Africa. And these small towns have very different but interesting histories. Musina is a border town. It's at the border of South Africa and Zimbabwe. So how vendors and pedestrians experience street spaces in that town actually in most cases differ from how vendors and pedestrians in Thohoyandou actually experience the spatial qualities on the streets. For example, Thohoyandou is a former Bantustan town, and it has a different historical context altogether. And sometimes the history and the geographical context actually affects how users perceive, how users experience their right to the city. Shall we go to the next slide? Oh, that's just the next 3 slides are just demonstrating the various street maps of the different towns, and from the maps, how the spatial layout of the maps actually has an impact on how users also experience their right to the city on the streets. Those are the different data collection methods that were utilized in the study. Next slide. How we analyzed our data. Next. On the findings, we had so many interesting findings, and from the quantitative and qualitative data, there's so much that we found. But I'll just summarize the key findings. We found out that there is a spatial justice paradox as users experience street spaces differently. By spatial justice paradox, we're saying that on that same space, users had different experiences, while other users were saying they were experiencing, positively experiencing their right to the city. On that same space, different users had a different experience. So that's on a particular space, users experience the right to similarities and right to differences at the same time. In a particular space, so many stories can be told at the same time. And the common contentious issues in all towns where users raised satisfaction was the issue of unavailability of public toilets and poor maintenance of street lights and the absence of street benches. Next slide, please. So that is a word presentation on how the users were actually experiencing their right to the city. Those issues, the issues in bold, were the issues that users were distinct on, or they emphasized on mostly. So you find that the issue of public toilets was highly emphasized by users in all the towns. Although in each town you find that there are variations, and users had also various expectations. For example, the issue of street benches was quite dominant in Louis Trichardt, and the issue of unavailability of water, whilst in Musina, some of the outstanding issues were issues of foreign nationals and issues of crime. They were coming out distinctly. And in Thohoyandou, the issues of narrow sidewalks and vending space were coming out distinctly. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to, in this presentation, to demonstrate by way of pictures how exactly these issues were coming to play, but it would have been interesting to show, to demonstrate. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the right to the city as a concept is a concept that evolved in the first world. However, as it has diffused to the third world, it's seemingly a concept that we use in many different contexts. So we can actually say there is the right to the city when it comes to public spaces such as streets, how users actually experience a public space has an effect on their right to the city. And users have have diverse rights, which sometimes conflict, and in some cases they negotiate on how they negotiate over these conflicts. Then, of course, the questions such as who has the right to the city and which right to the city always remain paradoxical, even in the context of pedestrians and vendors. You find that the pedestrians as a particular group of users, they are not a homogeneous group on their own, even though they are pedestrians. Some come to use the streets for shopping, some come to use the street for meetings. So they do have different experiences, whilst also vendors at some point become pedestrians, at some point become vehicular users. So they also have different perceptions on their right to the city experiences. So such questions always remain paradoxical. So the way forward, please, next slide. What is the way forward? Next slide, please. As part of our recommendations, we are recommending that there be a public space maintenance and management policy in the small towns as a way of addressing some of these inconsistencies that were evidenced when it comes to how streets are designed and managed in the small towns. There is really lack of specific roles, lack of specification on who plays what role when it comes to maintenance and management, as well as no clear vision on public space and management on street spaces. We also recommend what we term tactical urbanism towards the redress or towards addressing the challenges that come with street design and management in small towns. For example, planners and urban designers could start by addressing the issues that users were highlighting as most dissatisfying. So they could begin by addressing such issues and then improve incrementally the issues of public toilets, the issues of safety, providing sitting furniture, as well as creating and experimenting on spaces with both with the vendors and the pedestrians. We also recommend diversifying finance generation mechanisms so that streets can actually be improved to include street furniture and so forth that was required by pedestrians and vendors. Thank you very much for your time. That should be the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much, Wendy. A big applause to you. I really appreciate your presentation. I think there are so many ideas that we should investigate further. To work on this Pan-African city. in this concept of Pan-African city, and more in particular of the inclusive city. I will ask the audience if there are any urgent questions for Wendy. I'm looking at the chat box. All right, we can see something. So, okay. Let me see if Wendy. Yes, we have a question from Idris, I think. Yeah, sorry that I don't know why it's not showing. So, oh gosh. Just hold on a second. I'm trying to open better this one. What is the right to the city based on the user's perspectives measurement as against the defined right by the city management? Is there any identified conflict? Sorry, I don't know why it doesn't pop out. Okay, maybe like this it should. So there are indeed two questions.
Okay.
So yes, so the first question was, what is the right to the city based on the user's perspective measurements as against the defined right by the city management? Is there any identified conflict established from the study? And the second question is still from Idris. Did you attempt to compare the findings of the study with the existing UN Habitat International Guidelines for urban street planning and design? If yes, what is the feedback to UN Habitat on the need to review the guidelines for the future use of cities? If no, then the study should consider that as an area for further research. I think there are quite a lot of things to. Wendy, do you want to reply?
Okay, briefly. Thank you very much for the question, Idris. The first question is the first question on how users perceive the right to the city vis-a-vis how city management perceive the right to the city. From our study, we could identify that a conflict actually exists on how users perceive the right to the city and how the city management actually perceives it. For example, I could give an example of maybe the issue of public toilets, where the city where it is a requirement that if public toilets are available, users should pay a particular fee. But from the discussions with these users, they were challenging the publicness of the public toilets if they had to pay. Yet the city management deemed saw it fit that the public should pay so that it can actually cover for some of the basic maintenance, regular maintenance costs. So such questions would always emerge as on what users perceived and how the city management approach to the right to the city, and also issues such as the issue of public benches and so forth. In some cases, the city management would always argue that it's because there is inadequate space, but there is a way of playing around with space to make sure that the user's needs are met at the same time they experience their right to the city. Then on the second question, I hope I answered you on the first one. On the second question on the issue of international guidelines, thank you very much for that. Yes, we used the international guidelines on street planning and design. However, one of the challenges that we saw, it was the fact that the international guidelines, they are more general, they're broad and general guidelines. However, when it comes to the context of small towns, the issue of space always comes into play. I think when these small towns were designed, there was really no future planning as to increase the space of the streets. You find that, for example, when it comes to these standard guidelines, maybe a street should have a width of say 24 meters, so as to cater for 3 meters on both sides for sidewalks and also for the carriageway. However, when it comes to small towns, sidewalks in some cases have not been provided at all, and in some cases where they are trying to provide for them, they are very inadequate to allow for pedestrians and vendors to freely use the sidewalks. So as a result, there is always a conflict between pedestrians and vendors, as well as a conflict between the pedestrians and the vehicular users. So thank you very much. I think those would be my responses.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I can see Idris is happy with your response. Any further questions for Wendy today? If not, and if you have any other questions, you please note in the chat box so that we can try to find some time at the end this afternoon, actually. Thank you so much, Wendy. I hope to see you soon in South Africa. Please come and visit us in Durban. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So now we can move to our fourth presenter with a presentation that is titled A Sustainability Model for Integrated Indigenous and Modern Water Supply System in Rural Settlements of South Africa. The authors of this paper are Noxolo Nondumiso Ngema, Siekula Mbanga, Ayoade Adeniran, and Emmanuel Kabundu. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your names. So I think, yes, I can see Noxolo. Are you ready?
Yes. Good afternoon,
The floor is
everyone.
yours.
Thank you. Do I have access for sharing?
I think Musa
yes.
will give you right now. Thank you,
Yes,
Noxolo.
yes, you can share.
Okay, thank you. Just a moment. Good afternoon, colleagues, esteemed chairperson and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity. I believe we are all doing good in these trying times. I am Noxolo Ngema, a PhD candidate at Nelson Mandela University under the supervision of Professor Mbanga S. I will be presenting a study on a sustainability model for integrated indigenous and modern water supply system in rural settlements of South Africa. Please kindly note that the report is based on a PhD study which is still ongoing. Water is at the core of sustainable development and is crucial for socio-economic development, food and energy production, healthy ecosystems, and for human survival itself. The study sought to examine the shortcomings in the provision of clean water to rural settlements and how this affects the attainment of sustainable development goals, and thereby proposing a model which integrates indigenous and modern water supply methods to overcome water scarcity in rural areas. This is the outline of the study. It will flow from introduction, literature review, preliminary findings, and conclusion. A quarter of the world's population across 17 countries is living in regions of tremendously high water stress, with a measure of the level of competition over water resources. Qatar, Israel, and Lebanon were classified as the most stressed countries, water-stressed countries in the world, with Bugis in Afghanistan, and Gaborone and Jwaneng in Botswana are the world's most water-stressed regions. Sub-Saharan Africa suffers from frequently overstrained water system from rapid growth of urban areas. South Africa has the population of 59,197,704 people, with 67% of the population living in urban environment and 33% living in rural settlements. Currently, South Africa has access to surface water, a total of 77%, groundwater, total of 9%, recycled water with the total of 14%. Conversely, the population's dependence on water is not equally distributed. Rural settlements lack water infrastructure. As a result, 74% of all rural people are entirely dependent upon groundwater, such as local wells and pumps. Precisely, 19% of the rural population lack access to reliable water supply, and 33% do not have basic sanitation service. Over 26% of all schools, both in urban and rural settlements, and 45% of clinics also have no access to water supply. South Africa's policy of free basic water access, guaranteed by the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa 1996, states that every citizen is entitled to a certain amount of water regardless of that person's ability to pay for it. This policy defines the amount of entitlement be 6,000 liters per household per month. Meanwhile, rural areas lack water monitoring device. This has become a challenge for the organization in charge of water allocation, the South African Department of Water Affairs and Forestry, to effectively determine the amount of water people use per month in rural areas. Rural areas are deprived of access to ordinary public service such as water and sanitation, and are short of a formal local authority. Rural areas are also knowledgeable by a lack of adequate quantities of clean water. The scarcity of water in rural of South Africa hinders rural development. Although the South African government implemented several rural water supply schemes under the National Reconstruction and Development Program, NRDP, in places where rural water supply existed, drinking water continues to be of poor quality and is typically considered unsafe, with increasing privatization of water services. South Africa's history of apartheid geospatial planning has led to many rural areas lack access to basic supply and sanitation service. In eliminating the historical geospatial disparities and socio-economic inequalities, various programs have been introduced from 1994. Regardless of these programs, explicit inequalities in water infrastructure delivery still exist between rural and urban areas. Predominantly, rural provinces and small towns are characterized by relatively high water infrastructure backlog and low water service reliability. This exposes rural households excessively to economic water scarcity. From an African standpoint, water is not merely for economic and social importance, but also as well for cultural and spiritual significance. Historically, in South Africa, traditional leaders were primarily responsible for the management of water resources in their rural communities. Despite this, in the course of apartheid era, the role and powers of traditional leaders were restricted, and most aspects of decision-making concerning water resources were assigned to the apartheid government. Water infrastructure comprises of what is built to pump, divert, transport, store, treat, and deliver safe drinking water. Infrastructure entails a vast number of groundwater wells, surface water intakes, dams, reservoirs, storage tanks, drinking water facilities, pipes, and aqueducts. South Africa is extremely dependent on storage reservoirs to preserve dependable water supplies in times of water stress. Dams and rivers serve as a major water storage. Most 60% of the large dams in Africa are located in South Africa and Zimbabwe. South Africa has more than 500 large dams, of which 50 have storage capacity exceeding 100 million volume. The principal purpose of dams in South Africa is for irrigation and urban and industrial water supply. The scarcity of water is compounded by pollution of the surface and groundwater resources. The state of rivers and dams is an apprehension, as some rivers have excessively high levels of pollution. Groundwater is also significantly used in South Africa, predominantly in rural and more water-stressed areas. On the other hand, it is restricted by the geology of the country, greatly of which is hard rocks with large porous aquifers occur only in a few areas. South Africa's groundwater resources presently supply about 13% of total volume of water consumed nationally. The type of water sources includes dams and rivers, boreholes, springs, wells, rainwater. Figure 1 above illustrates South Africa's water resources by numbers. It states that 8% of South Africa's land area provide 50% of runoff. This 8% forms our water source areas. 21% of South Africa's reserves are less than 200 millimeters of rain a year. 9% of rainfalls end up as runoff in our reserve. 4% recharges our aquifers. 490 millimeters South Africa's average annual rainfall. 814 millimeters is the world average annual rainfall, and 1,800 is our average rate of potential evaporation, which is more than 3 times the rainfall. 49 billion in volume surface runoff, average annual runoff. Only 30% can be allocated at high assurance of supply, with 98% already allocated to users at high assurance of supply. 37% of water is lost in the current urban infrastructure. 15 billion in volume is the 2016 allocation. 17.7 in volume is the estimated demand reached by 2030, and this is beyond the limit of what can be safely allocated. Indigenous knowledge of water management. Water has a resilient link of the spiritual and physical well-being of humankind. The periphery and amid indigenous knowledge system and water security is signified in the traditional knowledge and skills in protection and management of water sources. The water knowledge that rural societies have can empower them to advance their capabilities to attain sustainable and equitable development. Indigenous methods of water resource management and irrigation method differs from canal, pond, and well digging to cultivation of low adaptive crops. Example of indigenous practice for water harvesting and management include rainwater harvesting. And there are several international classification of water harvesting methods, such as micro catchment methods, macro catchment methods, and floodwater methods. Gelesha, which in Xhosa means hoeing or tilting of the soil, is conversely the oldest Southern African documented technique that incorporates soil conservation and water harvesting. Stone terracing, homestead ponds, contouring, and the said dam, which is Afrikaans for planting dams, Kliplet and Van Giet in Afrikaans can be interpreted as paved rock and catch pits. Modern water supply network design and dimension. The purpose of a distribution network is to supply a community with the suitable quality and quantity of water. There are 4 network types: dead end, gridiron, circular, and radial systems. Networks are a system of pipes and trenches supplying the suitable quantity and quality of water to a community. The network construction and layout is cautiously arranged in order to ensure enough pressure and ensure hygienically safe water. Causes of water scarcity encompasses water stress.
Nopsolo?
Hi.
Hello, sorry to interrupt you. I tried to contact you on the chat box, but clearly you cannot see my message. I was asking you if it's possible for you to go straight to the fundings, because we are a little bit running out of time.
Okay.
Thank you. So sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, can I go through this slide and straight to findings?
Absolutely, please.
Yes, causes of water scarcity encompasses water stress, water crisis, water shortage, or water deficit. Water scarcity can be caused by physical water scarcity and economic water scarcity. Physical water scarcity refers to situation where natural water resources are incapable of meeting a region's water demand. Meanwhile, economic water scarcity is a result of poor water management resources. Water scarcity is caused by droughts, climate change, and variability, or overuse and misuse of water and pollution of water. Effect of water scarcity on education in rural areas. Education is a crucial tool for breaking the cycle of poverty. However, over half of the world's school lack access to safe water and sanitation facilities. Absence of clean water has severe effects on students' academic performance and attendance rates. Lack of safe water can cause students to lose momentum as they deal with stomach pains and diarrhea from diseases and hunger. Students miss class to go fetch water or to care for a sick parent or sibling. The water scarcity issue is twice hard for girls. With the lack of proper toilets in schools, girls drop out once they reach puberty. Furthermore, the society has imposed the responsibility of fetching water to women, thus limiting their access to both education and business opportunities. Education and water are intertwined with the challenges of gender equality. Water is linked to health. Millions of children get sick and die every year from waterborne diseases and also lack basic sanitation and hygiene. The preliminary findings, the inadequate water access to sustainable water is in the rural areas directly affect people within the settlements and other departments such as healthcare, community centers, schools, and agriculture. People in rural areas mostly depend on agriculture to make a living. Biological life depends on water, therefore it must be obtained at intervals by all plants and animals so that life develops around this need. Lack of water supply directly affects sanitation as well. Schools and clinics in rural areas do not have access to flushing toilets. It is impossible to achieve clean and sanitary environment without water. The progress of sanitation throughout the world has been closely associated with the availability of water. Over up to 80% of infection in the developing world are associated with inadequate water and sanitation. In numerous countries, pollution is contaminating reliable water sources. Water strain affects women and girls as they are regularly the primary managers of natural resources, specifically for household use and small-scale agriculture, and it alters their health, safety, and opportunity to engage in economic activities. The Sustainable Development Goal on water, regardless of the world progress, billions of people still lack safe water, sanitation, and hand washing facilities. Statistics proposes that attaining universal access to basic sanitation service by 2030 would necessitate doubling the present annual rate of advancement. Extra effective utilization and management of water are crucial to addressing the rising demands for water, pressure to water security, and increasing frequent and harshness of droughts and floods stemming from climate change. Sustainable Development Goal 6 aims on ensuring a clean and sustainable water supply and effective water sanitation for all people by year 2030. The goal is a response to the actuality that numerous people all over the world lack this basic service. Approximately 40% of the world's population is in distress by a lack of water. A global temperature increase, that total is projected to increase. In conclusion, cities around the world are faced with a range of pressure stemming from population expansion, climate change, and deterioration of urban infrastructure system. As water demand continues to rise in future, an increasing number of cities will face challenges of managing scarcer and less reliable water resources in an effective way. Business as usual is not the way forward. Reliable drinking water and suitable sanitation services are fundamental for human health. Water is amongst the critical substances on earth that are required for the survival of plants, animals, and humans. Thank you. Please note that the main findings of the study is still collected and yet to be analyzed as the study is still ongoing. No conclusion and recommendation has been drawn. Discussed on this finding in this report is preliminary findings emanating from literature review. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Noxolo. Thank you for a very detailed presentation. I'm just aware of time, conscious of time, so I will ask if there are any urgent questions for her to reply. Anyone? Otherwise, please note your questions. Oh, okay. We have one question from Idris. Let me just open it. All right. So, Noxolo, though the study is ongoing, it is important to take note of the following questions. What is the existing model for rural water supply system in rural settlements of South Africa? And secondly, what makes the model unsustainable that requires a new sustainable model through the study? Third question, is this model for formal water supply system, for example, municipal water supply, only or both formal and private, like for water vendors? So you have 3 questions in the chat box from Iris. Noxolo, if you want to reply.
Thank you for the question. As I've previously stated that most rural areas still depends on groundwater, which means most of them, they utilize wells, dams, and spring water. And those water infrastructures are not formal. Like the water is regarded as unsafe for consumption. So yes, a model it is required mostly to like integrate both modern and indigenous water supply systems, since rural areas are like also challenged by their geographical location. So supplying like the only the model water supply system is somehow impossible because of their demographic location. I'm not sure if I've answered everything. Otherwise, most of the response were there on the slides. It's so unfortunate that I couldn't go through all the slides.
Thank you, Noxolo. I'm sure that Idris, yeah, it says is happy with your reply. And then if you need any further detail, you can contact her directly via email. We can put you in contact with her. Thank you very much, Noxolo, and all the best for your PhD study. So now we can move to our last presenter, who are again from Nelson Mandela University, from the Faculty of Engineering, the Built Environment and Technology Department of Building and Human Settlements Development. The presentation title is Local Economic Development as a Pivot for Creating Resilient and Self-Sustaining Human Settlements in South Africa. And the authors are Dr. Purity Amunwa-Kwadi and Professor Mbanga. Thank you very much. I think I saw Professor Purity, are you here? Purity or Professor Mbanga, are you here with us? I'm actually going through the participant list and I cannot see them. Musa, do you have any updates on the presenters? Oh, okay, thank you, Idris. So the paper was presented already yesterday, so maybe was misplaced in this list. And because I got the list, I got the list today, so I thought it was an updated list. Musa, do you, I'm so sorry about this. I was not informed about this problem. Musa, do you have any updates on the presenter? Oh, shame. Thank you, Idris, for noting this. Does anyone know if there is then another presentation instead of this one that I just mentioned? I'm so sorry, but my
there's nothing I know from my side. If it was presented yesterday, then I guess that was the last presentation that we just had from Natal.
Okay. All right, then if you want, actually we have some time for the discussion. Okay, let me see. There are some messages. Yes. Okay, now that was the messages from Iris. So if you are happy, and since we have the time, I think we can have a discussion on the presentations that we had this morning. Of course, Chiara is not anymore with us because she was attending also the Urban Forum, but we can definitely discuss the other presentations if you agree. Or I'm not too sure if there are any other presentations that for some reason were misplaced and were not appearing in my agenda for today. No. Okay. So any thoughts around, for example, this morning, we can just quickly go through the program of today. So the very first presenter was a Cupid Alexander from Texas, and it was a very interesting presentation on the social dynamics of racism, reconciliation, and resiliency. We didn't have enough time to discuss and have more, thoughts around that. But Cupid, if you are happy, we can actually retrieve our discussion.
Yeah, I'm open to it. And I was so happy to hear from my colleagues from in their presentation. So I'm really excited. So yeah, whatever, if there are any questions, I'm more than open to answering them or hearing more from the other individuals on this panel.
I think with us, Chiara is not anymore with us because she's attending another conference, but we have Wendy with also a presentation, very interesting, on vendor and pedestrian experiences of their ride to the city in street design and management in small urban centers in the Wemba district. And then, of course, we have Noxolo. Please, we can definitely discuss all together, brainstorm some ideas on the theme of inclusivity, on inclusive cities. For example, well, I even have a question myself for Noxolo, is about how your model, for your sustainability model, is actually taken into account the inclusivity paradigm. Do you have so how specifically your study links to the theme of inclusivity? I was curious to know, because maybe I just want to know from you if there are any specific links to that.
Sorry, can you please repeat the question for me?
Sure. I was asking you, Noxolo, since how your presentation, your study, links to the key theme of today, which is the inclusivity paradigm. So how your sustainability model talks to the inclusivity paradigm, process, inclusivity challenges. Can you hear me, Noxolo?
Sorry, I lost connection for just a few seconds. I'm not sure if I've heard you well. You were talking about my study addressing inclusivity, and then
Yes.
I think you asked if there are specific links.
Yes, correct.
Links to the model. Is that what you were asking?
The links to the inclusivity.
Oh, no, I don't have any specific links as yet.
Okay, I was just wondering because this room 3, the theme of room 3 today was inclusivity. So I'm just sorry. Sorry, Nuni, you are unmuted for some reason. Oh, okay, we can see Prof. Chipungu. Maybe you can come and help us on this. Good morning.
Hi, Doc.
Good afternoon, actually.
How is Italy?
Is is bad.
It's bad.
Woof. Yeah.
Okay, Doc, I want to come in for the paper presented by Wendy.
Yes.
On vendor and pedestrian experiences. Right.
Yes.
I think the right to the city really is quite a very important subject, especially in post-apartheid and post-colonial, African cities. And one thing which is common and indeed, which is we may call it a problem in courts, of course, is the need to share urban space from an economic perspective. And the pedestrian walkways emerge as one of those critical areas where people are competing to make sure that they get something, to support their families. So livelihoods are there on the street. But then two critical issues. There is a danger of congesting those walkways in such a way that now it becomes a problem to allow pedestrian freedom of movement. Yet on one hand, we want to make sure that we maintain the livelihoods of those people who are trading from the streets. So where do we strike the balance on one hand, to make sure that we don't sort of affect the livelihood of those people. While on the other hand, we want to make sure that we maintain inclusivity in the use of that space by making sure that pedestrians are able to walk without any problem. And at the same time, to make sure that those who pay rentals to use the space, shop owners and the like, who are supposed to be sort of with exclusive rights to the shop frontages, are also able to maximize, to capitalize on that space. What mechanisms can we put in place to make sure that we meet this particular balance? I think that is my question, Doc.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you very much, Prof. I think it's a very, very valid question. Wendy, do you want to reply?
I think I would want to build on the question from Prof. It's actually one of the key things that, one of the key findings that we established from this study, that where we're saying that the issue becomes paradoxical, or the question of who's right and who has the right actually becomes very prominent, where we're saying there is that contestation over space, and we're saying that there is need to acknowledge the right to movement for the pedestrians, as well as the right to livelihoods for the informal traders, and the right to the shop frontages for the formal business persons. So as one of the recommendations that we made, and that I would like to propose, there is need for space negotiation amongst the different users. Though of course, usually in this space negotiation, you find that there are some people become losers, especially the pedestrians. In most cases, they end up using the carriageway because usually the business persons and the street vendors end up occupying the space or competing for the space. So still the need for this need for negotiation over use of space is important. I think I'd throw in this question to the floor and find out from other colleagues what they think can actually be done so that all users actually enjoy their right to the public space.
Colleagues, any thoughts around that? Perhaps Cupid, if you want to address or Prof. Chipungu, if you want to actually.
Yes, Doc, I can come on board there, but more or less to try to complicate the equation. Because as we observe now from most of these cities, both old and emerging in the African context, and I'm happy that we'll look at the experience of Wemba district. I happen to have been to closer districts like Makado, like Toyondo, where you find that there is also that need to bring on board new developments which are responsive to people's needs, like new shopping malls, which are emerging. Now, we are seeing a gradual migration, a gradual shift of commercial activities into the shopping malls, right? And in the process, we see segregation of space where the shopping malls are becoming spaces for the elite or those who can afford, from a commercial perspective, to pay the high rentals and continue to operate from those areas. And the old part of the city, the old so-called CBDs, are gradually degenerating into open street trading areas, where you find that the pedestrian walkways are becoming congested, as people compete to utilize that particular space. Yes, in as much as we are trying to find solutions to that, to come up with policy recommendations, but this new development, which comes in the form of segregatory use of space arising out of, can I say, economic differences, right? Where you find that those with capital, with enough resources, are able to go into better space for commercial purposes, that is in shopping malls. Whereas the poor are kept back away from commercial centers where they can't trade their wares. So in as much as we are talking about inclusivity, in the process, we are coming up with such an environment which is perpetuating segregation, but in another way. And indeed, this is something which we have to think about. And it's not only a feature which is common in the case of Wemba district. We have seen it happening also in big cities like Durban, for instance. We have seen a lot of shopping malls which are mushrooming around the city. But when you go into the CBD, you will see how space is being utilized. You will see the congestion. You will see also the contestations around the use of pedestrian walkways. And I'm sure that is an issue which we have to apply our minds on as we continue our journey into creating so-called smart cities which are responsive to everyone. Thank you, Doc.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Prof. Chipungu. I absolutely agree with your perception, and yeah, I think this is the issues of the malls and the issues of inclusivity are absolutely topical for us, for the South African city. I will be curious actually to extend this question to Cupid, to understand, for example, what is perception from an American point of view. What is your perception, for example, from, I know you're coming from Texas, and I was curious to see your view on this.
Yeah, so this is all interesting because how planning in space is used in the United States, in states like Texas and cities like Portland, the process and the requirements for the space looks different, but I think some of the issues are the same. So I heard the previous professor indicating that the central business districts are having open street training. There's a lack of pedestrian thoroughfare, so you can't get through sometimes. And then the high rents. How that's evidenced in the United States is generally, for instance, in Austin, Texas, we're building what's called a light rail, so a train system. But in the train system, it has to take land, and some of the land that's going to be taken for the train are from maybe low income economic entities, so businesses, and they have nowhere else to go. So instead of being able to be a part of the central city where there's going to be a lot of traffic, it's going to be really nice, they are having to move further and further out away from the commercial districts. And that's something that we're addressing, and we're trying to figure out ways that we will use our financial resources to either find new space for them, create new space for them, and if that can't happen, and that's part of the struggle and the journey, is figuring out how we're going to be able to share some of this. How it's evidenced also in the United States is that the cities, a lot of cities might maintain some level of segregation, and they're really actively working on using space a lot differently, but there are a lot of different proxies and processes that can eliminate that. Sometimes there might be requirements for height limits. Sometimes there are sight lines. So there's areas that you cannot build up to a certain height and you cannot remove a certain view. And as the city becomes a lot more dense, it's a lot more difficult for those who have a limited amount of income to participate. And it hurts a lot of people because sometimes they're in areas where they've been in the central city area. And as the city continues to grow and has parks and has sidewalks and has transportation and has restaurants, they no longer can afford to be there. And it doesn't seem like there are efforts to include them in there. So just hearing my colleagues speak about the right to the city, that's an ongoing thing in the United States also. It might appear different through the process, but the feeling feels the same.
Thank you, Cupid. That's absolutely insightful. Any further thoughts around these challenges? Musa, Edmore, please go ahead. I can see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you, Doc. I just wanted to make a contribution, maybe just a build up on what has been said already. I think one way of actually dealing with this contestation of space between informal traders and general city inhabitants is actually try to promote walkability, more of walkability, and actually reduce the use of motorized transport within our urban spaces or the CBD at large. There's an example which I can give from Harare, which is Zimbabwe. There's a street called the First Street. So in that street, they actually you don't actually see cars. You don't see cars in that street. So what you therefore find out is that there's a lot of informal traders in that street. And then as people are walking, they're actually buying from these informal traders, and also their shops, around. So it actually reduced this congestion of space, but also without actually taking it lightly, how it's actually affecting conventional shops or the formal shops, because these informal traders are actually in front of these big shops. So, but there is that, that blend in of, informality, and then in the formal shops, and then actually people or pedestrians actually moving in that without actually having a contestation with actually motorists. So promotion of walkability, and and we see as planners how we can actually decrease the use of cars. That can actually be another intervention to lessen this contestation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Musa. I totally agree with you. I think walkability is absolutely fundamental. It's key to achieve inclusivity. And I think we have a very good example also in Durban with the Warwick Junction, our market, who is one of the biggest, in South Africa, I believe, and is a place. Is the place for informal economy for excellence. I mean, it's literally a hub for the informal economy. So I do agree with you that I think the transport, it's crucial on this. So once the local authority can organize a public transport for everyone and make the city walkable, so basically providing access to all these to all these markets, all these places, public spaces, and in this case for the informal economy, then we are really becoming inclusive in that sense. Unfortunately, is not always the case. Transport, as you know, is becoming more and more expensive for everyone. And the use of cars, of private cars in South Africa is absolutely ridiculous and makes the city much more inaccessible for the urban poor, for example. So this is really not, it's something that should be immediately addressed, the access to these places in terms of mobility and transportation. And I'm not sure, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if other colleagues want to contribute to this. Idris. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on this? Or anyone else? All right. So any final thoughts, colleagues, that you want to? Oh, okay, sorry, Idris just wrote in the chat box that he has an issue with his mic. But yeah, he said it's okay. Colleagues, I will ask you again, if you have any further ideas or thoughts that you want to share, please type it in the chat box and then we will get back to you as soon as possible. So for now, I think we can go, we are close to our final remarks. So unfortunately, I just have to say that unfortunately, the last presentation was misplaced, clearly, because apparently it was presented yesterday. So we got non-updated agenda for today, but we had 4 very interesting presentation this morning. The first one from Cupid Alexander from Texas, around the social dynamics of racism, reconciliation, and resiliency. And he presented the case study in Texas. So it was absolutely insightful and a lot of ideas that we should also consider for our Pan-African city, an inclusive city in South Africa. The second presenter was Chiara Rampol from UKZN, and she presented her research on exploring the concept of women paving the way to an inclusive Pan-African city. And that was a very interesting new perspective from a more gender-focused and I think is something that is absolutely crucial for our Pan-Africa city of today. Then we got the very interesting, insightful presentation of Wendy Tsorio from that was on vendor and pedestrian experiences of the right of the city, and the case study in the Wemba district in South Africa. Again, I'm very I think Wendy, your presentation was very much spot on with the topic of today of inclusivity and the right to the city. Again, the access, you know, to public spaces and how well, the street design and how the management in the smaller centers affect the vendors and the pedestrian experience. And it was very, very insightful. Thank you for that, Wendy. And then we go to the 4th presentation, which in a way was a little bit the presentation of Noxolo with her, as part of her PhD study on a sustainability model for integrated indigenous and modern water supply systems in rural settlement of South Africa. It was a very interesting presentation presenting her preliminary findings from her PhD study, which she's doing at the Nelson Mandela University under Professor Mbanga supervision. The only thing is that I believe our presentation was misplaced in terms of the general theme of the room. Because our theme was inclusivity, and perhaps this study talks more about, in general, sustainability issues, and not specifically with the inclusivity challenges. But I will speak to the conference organizer to ensure that the presentation is included in the right, section. So I will ask colleagues, do you have any further comments or questions for today, or can we close our session on inclusivity? Cupid said nothing more to add. Any final remarks, colleagues? Anything else? Noxolo said, thank you, I will greatly appreciate that. Absolutely, no problem. So then, colleagues, thank you so much for attending today. We are so excited to have you today in this session on inclusivity. All the best for your studies, and please let us know if you have any further questions or remarks, and we will get in contact with you as soon as possible. Thank you so much, and bye-bye from a very, very hot Italy.